Then the PDF files are there. Everything is like all of the audios, video materials are there. And then you can, for example, the teacher send me emails and ask for syllabus or class schedule or key, answer key, and I just send them those. So it's everything for free. Students, actually, I tell my students that you don't need to buy the textbook. You can print the textbook. But the textbook now is a little cheap, so people end up buying the textbook. Most of, maybe one student didn't, and then he regretted that because the textbook is colorful, full of beautiful pictures and images. So yeah, it's free, and it makes a huge difference when it comes to the cost and actually a kind of marketing, right? Because people look at everything and they think, oh, the website, they think that it's free. I'm going to start, right? Just using it, and it's in the beginning, it's a kind of self study book. So they start and they continue. Yeah. Okay, but let's ask a few questions before we move forward. How many of you think, ask about this question, how many of you think your students mostly appreciate focusing on cognitive skills in the class, or, higher notions, as we say? And how many of you think your students mostly appreciate a lecture on grammar and not being asked to speak in class? And how many of you think that your students need to learn the language to communicate in second language? So we always need to consider wants and needs, right? What they want and what they actually need. Let's have this in mind and move forward. My next experience, a few months later, I was talking about that. My first student, now this is another group of students, 12 students from Japan who came to Shiraz for study abroad. It was a little better since I felt more confident, and although I didn't totally refuse to use the textbook suggested by another professor of mine, the semi-grammar translation textbook, I was able to sneak in newspapers, maps, songs, brochures, posters, and whatever was around. And basically, we just used one lesson from the textbook we were recommended. So yeah, that was the beginning of, that was my first experience actually developing materials and projects based on my students' needs and objectives with the knowledge I had, and mostly out of need and misery. You may think the situation with Persian must have been so bad, but we probably had a good textbook for teaching English in Iran. The answer is no. If you wanted to learn English in Iran, you could not count on schools or universities. You had to go to private classes, which were and are quite popular in Iran. And to give you a good example, I did my bachelor's in English translation, and I could barely, it's embarrassing, keep my speaking skills at intermediate level when I graduated. And I was a good student. No one expects you to be able to speak English as a result of attending your English classes at public schools in Iran. There are many reasons for that, including the books were not proficiency-based. The teachers could barely speak the language themselves since they were not trained to speak the language, and they were doing the same for us. And I would like to show you this note from Clark and Pedersen, 1986. And I would like to actually read the first two parts. The most resilient or core teachers' beliefs are formed on the basis of teachers' own schooling as young students while observing teachers who taught them. So that's why the teachers believe, and they don't change, right? Subsequent teacher education appears not to disturb these early beliefs, not least perhaps because it rarely addresses them. And second, if teachers actually try out a particular innovation which doesn't initially conform to their prior beliefs or principles, and the innovation proves helpful or stressful, then accommodation of an alternative belief or principle is more possible than in any other circumstances. So I would like you to have that in mind, so I don't blame my teachers. And the objectives of the English and the, let's go back to the, yeah. The objectives of the English courses were mostly covering the textbook and pass the test. The final assessments consisted of reading comprehension, knowing the vocabulary, knowing the grammar, all passive skills. We had a section called oral production in high school. You think that that means speaking? No. It was basically reading text loud, a pronunciation test. Right? I'm sure you can relate to that. So the textbooks were a combination of application of grammar, translation, and audiolingual method, very outdated teaching methods. They had a very organized list of grammar and vocabulary, reassuring references for students and teachers to look at and feel good about their accomplishment. Could the students use the language they had learned? That was not the problem or need. In private classes, the situation was better because the teachers had to be able to speak the language. These teachers had either had the opportunity to live abroad or they had high aptitude in language learning. That's my assumption. Most of these people were not trained to be teachers, but training was a part of their job requirement. But still, the training was mostly on how to teach the section of the textbook. There was no training on the language teaching philosophy and how a language is learned. So the training would be reduced to methodologies that sometimes teacher would fail to apply since they didn't know the reason behind activities, and we mentioned what Clark and Pedersen says. Even with that better situation, many kids would stop in novice high after a few years of attending these classes. And the problem, again, was the focus on covering the textbook instead of using the textbook. The class was in control of the teacher and the kids who could speak the language. And the activities were not required all of the students to be actively and spontaneously engaged in a conversation. If a student, as a student you couldn't speak the language, that was your problem. Most of these textbooks would start with a conversation, followed by listening comprehension. We know that pronunciation practice, introducing a few new words, fill in the blank with new words, a few speaking activity, grammar explanation, and writing section. So they made sure that all areas and core skills were covered. But the time spent on speaking in pair or groups in which each student had the opportunity to talk was almost none. The teacher was the center of the class, and if you had not memorized the dialogue, you would be in trouble. We had speaking activities that our teacher would use as reading activities. Unfortunately, the textbooks, which were claimed to follow communicative approach, could not fix the problem, even communicative. Because in the best case scenario, teacher didn't know the philosophy behind the exercises. During the second and last year of my master's, I had come to the conclusion that there is no Persian textbook that is close to what we call proficiency-based language teaching. There was no textbook that included function of the language, for example, let alone follow the communicative approach. I chose to do my thesis on functions in Persian to be able to use it as a resource for my own future materials. So I reviewed most of the textbook for Persian more precisely, and I traveled around the country to evaluate the programs which were offering Persian. The research, the search and the trip they were not promising. A year later, I was a PhD student in second language acquisition at the University of Maryland, and I was reading about the research in the field. Oh yeah, I forgot to put this on. And which I could barely see any of these results being applied in the Persian classrooms. I left my PhD and came to UT to start teaching, and my first year at UT was hell. I was not able to choose a textbook for my students based on what I knew would work in a language class because I couldn't find one. And I had mixed classes, heritage and non-heritage, although we had enough students to separate them. It looked like no need for separation was felt in most of the Persian courses, grammar, translation, or any other instructor-centered method would do the work for mixed classes. No one knows the grammar, right, or difficult vocabulary, so let's teach the grammar and everybody's happy. no complaining by students, since speaking the language was not expected, and speaking the language is the most stressful skill for non-heritage students, especially if you haven't helped them to acquire it. Heritage students get easy A's, and non-heritage students will feel confident since they are learning the grammar better than non-heritage. An ideal class in which you barely learn the language. That was the situation and a little bit of background. Let's go to section 3, the last the one that we have discussion. The challenge now was to develop a curriculum which at least gets me out of this hell. I started supplementing the textbooks. So I was supplementing 2 different textbooks with communicative exercises. Dr. Kristen Brustad came to rescue and sat with me and helped me figure out what I needed for each textbook. Those meetings later were my springboard. Supplementing the textbooks was a little chaotic. I was just designing the speaking activities, the books lacked, and actually some of the students started speaking the language a little bit. I'm happy that that didn't trick me. The problem with supplementing is that I was putting so much energy in supplementing the materials that I would not approve its approach and philosophy. I have hundreds of activities that I eventually shared with the author of one of the textbooks, and he was kind enough not get offended. But at the end of the day, I consider that work waste. It's not that I did not learn anything, I learned a lot, but when you are working with materials with traditional approach to language learning, it doesn't matter how good you can write communicative activities, the book's structure and approach set the student's mindset. I started developing the textbook my second year at UT, and again with the push from Dr. Bursad, my starting point was setting the goal and objectives, which I put together based on actual performance descriptors. The second step was to make the shelves that I needed to put the materials in. That was probably the most difficult and time-consuming of the project. It took me hundreds of hours of work and lots of unsuccessful design until I reached the final one. There were a few points that not only made the whole process, I would like to mention that. There were a few points that not only made the whole process of developing the textbook, but my teaching experience easier and clearer and more focused, including the important role of flipped classroom. I barely introduced new materials in class now. The important role of speaking activities for activating the knowledge, which is doable when you have a flipped classroom. The important role of constant and daily assessment, and the important role of homework correction and feedback. When I evaluate a textbook, first thing I check is how and if it is close to actual performance descriptor for language learners, and if allow the instructor to do a flipped classroom, and if they have enough speaking activities to draw output, or if they don't have enough speaking activities, they have the space for the instructor to create them. So you have time? Okay, discussion and evaluation. So I would like, I ask you to bring one of your textbook, or if you have a unit, or if you have access to a unit of your textbook, that would be great. I would like you to choose a unit, and if you're supplementing materials, you can list them. And there are a few questions that you may want to answer, like what level of proficiency do I expect the student to have by the end of the course, and where is this lesson situated in our effort to reach that level. But for now, forget all of these questions for now, and for the sake of this evaluation, I would like to ask you to go through the unit and find out how much of your class time is spent on activating students' knowledge of the language dictated by your textbook. Don't count the exposure to the language, but consider the time students are activating the vocabulary and grammar. Let's put it in like these additional terms. Mark the ones which are not activating the grammar and vocabulary and can be learned outside class, but you do them in class. Okay? And then let's share our findings. We have some time to work on it.
I'm just trying to figure out. I don't know. I haven't. But I do know that she created.
So people gradually come back here.
Persian today. One of them, he said that for lower education, he invited so they can compare between the languages. I'm teaching So at first when I presented it and so on, I went down to live in Iran, so I was speaking English to Yeah, because at the beginning you said that you are in Iran, teaching there, so I thought that's understood and